The judges are coming. I'm about to begin. Yeah, they can come out. Turn it that way, and the camera's up there. So they're going to watch you, but you want to have a conversation with the judges. Exactly. So that you can thank her. If you want to move your chair out of the trees, you can do that. It's a hostile crowd. I don't know who they're going to vote for. Sorry? I don't know who they're going to support. I'm just giving the crowd. Oh, yeah. That's not a good question. Gene and I will get run for your money. I didn't really think about it when I was asked, and I realized that have her do her thing. You gotta have That's right. We're just waiting for the judges. They're going to be coming through the center door. So it will start in just a moment. Judges always keep you waiting, right? Mm-hmm. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blessed him that gives and him that takes. From Portia, from the Merchant of Venice. Good evening, Justice Ginsburg, esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to the Coolidge Auditorium for tonight's very special performance. My name is Elizabeth Pugh, and I am honored to serve as the General Counsel for the Library of Congress. Our law librarian, Jane Sanchez, could not be with us this evening, so I'm thrilled to be able to open tonight's event on behalf of the Law Library of Congress. The Law Library is the custodian of the world's largest collection of legal materials, with nearly 3 million items, and counting, in numerous languages and formats. The Law Library serves all 3 branches of the United States government: the practicing bar, state and local governments, American businesses, scholars, and the world legal community. Throughout the year, the Law Library presents many public programs focused on current legal topics. Coming this fall, look out for events celebrating Constitution Day, Human Rights Day, as well as the Kellogg Biennial Lecture on Jurisprudence. Tonight's performance is the last of a series of 3 events commemorating the 500th anniversary of the establishment of the Jewish ghetto in Venice, Italy. The Law Library previously held 2 lectures, the first one in 2016, entitled "The City of the Jews, Segregated Space, and the Admission of Strangers in the Jewish Ghetto of Venice," and another this past February, "Understanding Seclusion, the Legal Dimensions of the Ghetto." You can find videos of both of these events on the Law Library's YouTube channel. This event tonight was made possible by a generous donation to the Library of Congress from the American Sephardi Federation. The library also gratefully recognizes a contribution received through the Friends of the Law Library of Congress from Thomas Reuters, and additional support was provided by Mr. Robert S. Roth, Jr. This mock trial was staged last year in Venice, Italy, as part of the city's 500th anniversary commemorations. We are fortunate that the coordinator for last year's event agreed to reprise his role for us in the United States. For his efforts to produce tonight's performance, I would like to recognize Dick Schneider, Associate Dean for International Affairs and Professor of Law at Wake Forest University School of Law. And the only male judge on our bench tonight.
Justice will be done.
And let me introduce the distinguished cast. Arguing on behalf of Portia, Teresa Miguel Stearns of the Lillian Goldman Law Library of Yale Law School. Arguing on behalf of Antonio and the Republic of Venice, Eugene Galland of Covington and Burling. And arguing on behalf of Shylock, Michael Klotz of Jones Day. And now our distinguished panel of judges. Michaela Del Monte of the European Parliament Research Service. Suzanne Reynolds, Dean of Wake Forest University School of Law. Dick Schneider, also of Wake Forest University School of Law. Ambassador Connie Morella. And the judge who needs no introduction, but I'm going to say it. The judge who will deliver the final verdict, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And finally, finally playing the man whose fate hangs in the balance is Ed Giroux as Shylock. I think he'll appear later. Before we get to the trial, you will hear from 2 speakers. David Dangor of the American Sephardi Federation will help us understand the history of the Sephardic Jews, their connection to Venice, and the diaspora. Michael Kahn of the Shakespeare Theatre Company will refresh our memories on the plot of The Merchant in Venice in order to help frame the scene that you will see on tonight's stage. And then after the judges take recess for deliberations, you will hear from Professor Jim Shapiro of Columbia University, who will go into more depth about The Merchant of Venice during Shakespeare's time. So before the performance begins, I'd like to remind you to kindly switch your mobile phones and other devices to the silent mode. And please note that tonight's program is being recorded as a Facebook live stream and for later presentation on the Law Library's YouTube channel. And now, I would like to invite David Dangor to the stage.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the American Sephardi Federation, I'm very pleased to be able to stand in front of you and be a sponsor of today's interesting event. And obviously, it's a great honor for us to be associated with this distinguished panel of judges and Judge Ginsburg. I will very briefly just tell you something in context about this play and the importance to Jewish history. The American Sephardi Federation is an organization that is strictly cultural and historic, and we study the history and we preserve and promote the history of what I would call the unknown Jews. There's a very large contingent of Jews that come from the Middle East, the Far East, North Africa, and originally some of them from Spain and Portugal. They are largely forgotten in history today, and you will see why we want to be associated with this event. We represent the Jewish history of all these Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, the Balkans, the Middle East, North Africa, the Far East, and importantly, early American history. The Jews came here very early via mainly the Caribbean. So it's therefore a special pleasure today, on behalf of the American Sephardi Federation, to convey that we have since long adopted Shylock of the Merchant of Venice as a Sephardic Jew, i.e. a Jew originating from the mass exodus of Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, and in his case, likely from Spain. A specific history that we at the Federation guard and study among several other Jewish histories. There are hints in the Shakespeare play that this very well probably is a Sephardic Jew from Spain. Before I explain, allow me first to outline why in some way the play The Merchant of Venice is to be viewed as a gift to the Jewish people by Shakespeare. This is the perspective. Because of the understandable enormous historical and social attention to the horrors of the Holocaust, there's little focus and interest to remind us today of the terrible plight in Europe for the Jewish people from the latter half of the Middle Ages throughout the early modern period, culminating in the Holocaust and the failed mass attack and attempt to drive the Jews into the Mediterranean in 1948. Because of the brilliance and fame of Shakespeare and the brilliance of his play, The Merchant of Venice functions as a reminder of the long-standing and vile injustice toward the Jewish people. This will continue to help to revisit earlier Jewish history, including, for example, the slaughter of the innocent large Jewish communities along the Rhine River in Europe, southern France, of the detestable Inquisition with burnings at the stake, blind libel, and mass expulsions in Spain, Portugal, and its sideshows in Sicily and Venice, and many other parts of the Mediterranean. At the time of Shakespeare writing the play, there still were many show trials of Jews and so-called conversos, including in Venice. And in England at the time, to use a later term, England was Judenfrei, following their expulsion in 1290 in the Elizabethan era, which was very anti-Jewish. Jews were only allowed back in 1656 under Cromwell, some 60 years after The Merchant of Venice. In summary, wearing a historical hat, it's noteworthy that the play at the time only deals with basically financial matters and not something much worse, which would have been typical of the day. In other words, for this reason, and the famous monologue in the play, optimistically viewed, maybe this is one of the early European and English attempts to humanize Jews. The next attempt in England really only came with Sir Walter Scott's widely popular novel, Ivanhoe, in 1820, with Rebecca and her father being among the lead characters, perhaps even paving the way for Disraeli's ascendance as Prime Minister in England in 1868, 200 years after The Merchant of Venice. The Venetian ghetto, where Jews had to live, was constituted in 1516, as you heard, only 14 years after the Spanish Inquisition in 1492. Several very wealthy Sephardic Jewish trading families fled to Venice, where Jews had been allowed to live more freely in the Venetian Republic. There's little doubt that the ghetto, with its strict boundaries, was a result of the Inquisition fever sweeping the realms of the Catholic Church. The ghetto was divided into two areas, the Ghetto Nuovo, the new ghetto, and the adjacent Ghetto Viejo, the old ghetto. These names of the ghetto sections are misleading, as actually the Ghetto Nuovo is the older one. A large number of Jews from different backgrounds came to live in the ghetto, but over time they never developed a distinct Venetian identity. Instead, they continued strongly to identify with their origins. Therefore, 4 of the 5 synagogues were clearly divided according to ethnic identity in the ghetto. The German synagogue, the Italian synagogue, the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, and the Levantine synagogue. There was a 5th synagogue, the so-called Canton synagogue, that was built specifically for a private use by 4 families. The languages spoken at the time in the ghetto included Venetian, Italian, Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Arabic, Spanish, French, and German, while Hebrew was traditionally used on signage, inscriptions, and for official purposes, as well as wedding contracts and, of course, in religious services. Allow me, finally, a quick background on the word ghetto. Like with so much about the play, there are different explanations and theories about the origins of the word. Some say the word originates from the foundries in Venice, where the Italian word ghetto is very similar to ghetto, but it's most likely that the word ghetto derives from the Gothic word gatto, which means street. And the reason for that is the Jews throughout the Middle Ages usually congregated along one street where they would have all their shops and places of commerce. So it was very easy to decide to enclose a street like that and put up boundaries and make it into a ghetto. The strict confinement of the Jews in Venetian ghetto ended with an edict by the 28-year-old Napoleon in 1797, following his conquest and dissolving of the Venetian Republic. That's what you need to know. Thank you.
Good evening. I've been given the task of explaining to you a play that I think you've all seen and read, but I've been told to maybe refresh your minds about the story. Let me tell you that it was first published in 1600, and that Shakespeare, as much of the time, took the stories that he had read that were written earlier. One was the story of the bond of flesh, and the other was the story of the caskets. Now, the Merchant of Venice, we very often confuse the fact, we think because Shylock is such a vibrant character, we think that the Merchant of Venice is Shylock, but indeed he's not. He is the real Merchant of Venice, Antonio, a trader. In the beginning of the play, we find Antonio with several of his friends, young men, among whom are Bassanio and Lorenzo. Bassanio has come to Antonio, admitting that he has spent a lot of Antonio's money trying to better himself and also buying a lot of very good items and clothes that have made him a great man about town. But he tells Antonio that he has the possibility of repaying all of that money again because he has found a beautiful heiress living on an island outside of Venice who is named Portia, and he wishes to vie for her in marriage. Antonio, who says he doesn't have very much money at the moment, but says, for you, I want to do this. And he goes to the only place that he can get this money, and that is to Shylock, who lends money. Shylock tells him first, of course, of how badly he and his fellow Jews have been treated by the Christians of Venice, and yet they come to him for money. But he says, I will do this. And in the process of this negotiation, he says, you know, I am not going to charge you anything. I just want, if you do not repay me in a merry jest, let me say I will take a pound of your flesh to be cut from wherever in your body I wish. Antonio, who has been a successful merchant, finds this actually a charitable request because it's basically impossible. And he comes home with the money, and Bassanio goes off to Belmont to woo Portia. There is another friend of Shylock that we should mention, and that is young Lorenzo. Lorenzo has seen and become attracted to, and perhaps fallen in love with a young Jewess who lives in the ghetto, Jessica. Jessica is Shylock's daughter. At one point in the play, rather early on, Lorenzo abducts Jessica, quite willingly, who leaves the ghetto and her father with a great deal of his money. Shylock is deeply, deeply, deeply distressed by this. Antonio's ventures at sea prove to be disastrous. The ships are wrecked, and Antonio cannot pay Shylock back. This comes very soon after his daughter has been stolen, and Shylock demands that the bond be paid and that the pound of flesh be taken from Antonio's body. There is a great trial, which will be discussed tonight. And in that trial, Portia arrives dressed as a man and pretends to be a lawyer, and eventually wins Antonio's suit. And Shylock is not only asked to give up his money, but is also asked and told he must be baptized as a Christian at the end of this trial. There is one more act of this play where everybody goes back to Belmont and seems to get along very well in some productions, and other productions not so well. But it is why Shylock, who ends the fourth act, the fifth act is Belmont, and that is why this play is always put as one of Shakespeare's comedies, because it seems to have a happy ending. But there is no question that the resonant issue of this play and the largest character in this play is Shylock and his fate. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight.
Good evening. In this first speech, Shylock expresses his surprise at Antonio's request for a loan. Signor Antonio, many a time and oft in the Rialto you have rated me about my monies and my usances. Still have I borne it with a patient shrug, for suffering is the badge of all our tribe. You call me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spat upon my Jewish gabardine, and all for use of that which is mine own. Well then, it now appears you need my help. Go to then. You come to me and you say, Shylock, we would have monies. You say so. You, that did void your room upon my beard and foot me as you spurn a stranger cur over your threshold. Monies is your suit. What should I say to you? Should I not say, hath a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats? Or shall I bend low and in the bondman's key with bated breath and whispering humbleness say this, fair sir, you spat on me on Wednesday last. You spurned me such a day. Another time you called me dog. And for these courtesies, I'll lend you thus much monies. In the next speech, Shylock is discussing the terms of the forfeiture of his loan should Antonio default, and he reveals what he values in a pound of flesh. To bait fish withal, if it will feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not the Jew eyes? Hath not the Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why revenge? The villainy you teach me I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. And lastly, Shylock argues in court against using mercy to temper justice in the hopes of receiving the same kindness in God's final judgment. What judgment shall I dread doing no wrong? You have among you many a purchased slave, which like your asses and your dogs and mules, you use in abject and in slavish parts because you bought them. Shall I say to you, let them be free? Marry them to your heirs. Why sweat they under burdens? Let their beds be made as soft as yours, and let their palates be seasoned with such viands. You will answer, the slaves are ours. So do I answer you. The pound of flesh which I demand of him is dearly bought. 'Tis mine, and I will have it. If you deny me, fie upon your law. There is no force in the decrees of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer. Shall I have it?
We will now proceed with Shylock's appeal. And before we do so, let me caution counsel that the bench is having great difficulty hearing. So if you might tip the podium slightly and speak very distinctly. We will hear first from Shylock's counsel.
Good afternoon, Your Honors. I'm Michael Klotz, counsel for the appellant, Shylock. Before I begin, I'd like to reserve 2 minutes for rebuttal.
You may.
There are two central issues in this appeal. The first issue is whether a party that's entered into agreement and hasn't fulfilled its obligations is able to keep the fruits of the agreement. My client, Shylock, entered into a loan agreement for 3,000 ducats, and the ducats were lent to Bassanio. And Antonio was the guarantor for that loan. And it was for a term of 3 months, and the loan came due, and the money was not repaid. And to this day, Antonio continues to hold the money, and no interest has been paid, and my client has been out of luck. The second issue in this appeal is whether a non-citizen who goes to a court and requests a legal judgment can in doing so, commit a criminal act. And that's what my client has been convicted of. Shylock went to the court and asked to have the contract enforced, and he asked specifically to have the penalty provision enforced. And unbeknownst to him, Portia was disguised as a judge, and she's not a judge. And she issued a judgment. She issued a judgment against him, and she found that he violated the Alien Act, which protects against any non-citizen attempting to take the life of a citizen. And so in making this appeal to the court, saying, please give me the money that's due under this agreement, Portia said that this was attempted murder. And our argument on that issue is that can't be. It can't be the case that when somebody goes to a court and asks for justice, that that's a crime. So we ask that the judgment be reversed without retrial. We ask for the money to come back. We're asking for interest and any other relief that the court deems fit.
I'd like clarification on 2 points. One, are you demanding the pound of flesh, or have you relinquished that request?
Your Honor, we're relinquishing that request, but we believe that that aspect of the contract was valid and legal.
So you are not demanding a pound of flesh, you're demanding your return of your money. You said interest, but I think the record shows that at the time this loan was negotiated, you said not a doit of usance for my money. You were giving the money, and you were not demanding interest, you were demanding only the pound of flesh. Is it not true that you relinquished any claim to interest?
Your Honor, in that same negotiation, my client referenced that when the loan came due, that he would be given such sum or sums as are due under the agreement. So I think it would be up to the court to examine the contract and determine whether there's prejudgment interest. The prejudgment interest is for the 3-month period of the loan, and the post-judgment interest is from when the loan came due until today.
There's another unusual feature of this proceeding. Antonio is surety. The beneficiary of the loan is Bassanio, but you are not suing Bassanio. You brought a suit against Antonio.
That's correct, Your Honor. He was the guarantor on the loan, and he was the recipient with the Republic of Venice of the money, the underlying money for this agreement.
Even though you knew full well that Bassanio had the wherewithal to pay back the loan, and then there would be no claim against Shylock.
You're correct, Your Honor. We chose the defendants to sue, and we didn't sue Bassanio.
Counsel, why is it that you're asking for the money now when you were offered the money at trial and refused it?
Well, our position has changed, Your Honor. I mean, at trial, we were requesting specific performance, and it wasn't given to us. And then we then asked for the money, and we were told that that was impossible. Portia interpreted the contract in a way that, as I believe the court will realize, is totally improper. She interpreted the agreement to allow a pound of flesh, but to allow no blood and absolutely no more or less than a pound of flesh. So she interpreted the agreement in a way that it couldn't be performed.
Mr. Klotz, what role do you think Portia's deception plays in this proceeding?
Portia's deception is egregious. She's not an attorney. She was not a judge. She was not a part of any court. She obviously misrepresented who she was. And I think perhaps most significantly, she was married to Bassanio, who Justice Ginsburg has pointed out was the obligor on the loan. So she had a direct financial interest in the outcome.
And what specific defense does that give your client?
Well, I mean, because two people can sit down and agree, this is what you will do, this is what I will do, and they make their own law, essentially. And so my client was very angry and very upset when in this one aspect of his life that he could control, his rights were not being recognized.
We heard that Shylock was in a state of extreme distress. Are you making any plea that he would be incompetent to have been accused of a criminal action because he was so distraught at his daughter's elopement and her theft of his worldly goods?
Your Honor, we're not arguing that Shylock intent to murder. There's no act of actually of doing anything. he can't be convicted for murderous words any more than anyone else could, saying, I want to do this. I mean, his situation, Your Honor, would be comparable to a murder trial where a parent comes in and says to the court, this man should be executed, and then that person was arrested for murder. I mean, that would be a relatively similar
I thought you
situation.
started out with the point that he couldn't be tried for murder when all he did was bring a civil suit to enforce a contract.
Yes, Your Honor. No, I don't. I think both things are true. I think that it's totally inappropriate, and it's totally inappropriate that any request of a court could be a criminal act. And so for that reason, I don't think it's possible to convict him under the Alien Act. I don't think there's any way that this can be attempted murder. And separately, and a not inconsistent point, he didn't do anything. I mean, during this scene, he had a knife, and he said some words that he may regret. But nothing else happened.
But the question of motive is important to us. It's important in terms of thinking of what Shylock did and how we should rule here. I mean, one motive is revenge, which obviously would be caught up with the murder. But you make an argument in your brief, and that you just mentioned a minute ago, that Shylock was in fact, in a sense, rebelling through this contract. I'm not sure I really understand what you mean by that. Maybe could you elaborate a little bit on that for us? What do you mean what was Shylock doing here if it wasn't revenge?
Yes, Your Honor. So, I mean, the attempt to enforce the penalty provision was a rebellion against the Venetian laws that treated him so differently, and then this is the one area where he was able to do something. He was able to sort of set the terms of his life. And the other part of it is during the proceeding, what Shylock points out about Antonio and the other Venetian merchants is the incredible hypocrisy. Venetian capitalism, there's trade in many things, but one of the main aspects of trade was slavery. And so it seems very hypocritical and improper that merchants like Antonio should be able to grow wealthy selling people against their will, and my client should not be able to recover the penalty provision, even though there's a physical component to it.
I'm trying to understand that there was a contract. They actually made a legal contract, even though Shylock said something about it being a merry joke or something, which meant that they fully expected the money would be returned on time. But then he perseveres for the pound of flesh. But then when he finds out about the blood, and he says he wants it by the heart, did he think it could be done in some other way so that Antonio would not die? I mean, what did you find out in your investigation of this case? What he had in mind?
Shylock did not intend to murder Antonio. It was a pound of flesh. It was not a dagger in the heart or anything like that.
He wanted it near the heart, didn't he? Yeah.
He wanted it near the heart, but the court doesn't know any more than I do if he'd been granted that. If Portia had granted him that right and she'd enforced that right of specific performance, he might have dropped the knife and asked for the money instead. I mean, there's no way to know at this point.
In any case, the money, we have settled that the pound of flesh is out of the case now. It's just a matter of money.
Yes, Your Honor. No, we're not seeking the pound of flesh, and after all this time, we're not trying to come and have that be enforced.
But if you're seeking, Mr. Klotz, if you're just focusing on the civil action and you're not seeking the pound of flesh, you're seeking only the repayment of the money plus interest. Isn't this a claim not raised below? This is an appellate court. Did you raise this claim below?
That's a great question, Your Honor.
Thank you.
I take it you're seeking a substitutional remedy since the one you asked for, the law does not permit.
Well, what I think, Your Honor, is, the proceeding was obviously, it was totally improper with Portia acting as the judge, but the other main point that we haven't discussed yet, but is discussed in the brief, is the incredible duress for my client during the proceeding. First, Portia says, you can get the pound of flesh, you don't get blood, you don't get any more or less than that. Shylock then asked for the money and was told no. Portia then said that he violated the Alien Act supposedly for making this request of the court, and then Shylock was forced to convert to Christianity, and the Duke said very clearly if he didn't do that, then he was going to be executed. So to the extent that there's a waiver argument, I think that maybe we can let that slide. But we're asking this court, in addition to follow up on your point, besides the civil remedy, which is the return of the 3,000 ducats and the interest, we're asking to have my client's name cleared after all this time. There's nothing that we can do about this improper verdict other than to completely nullify it.
You made a comment about the Alien Act. Are you arguing that the Alien Act in itself, and maybe you could explain exactly what that is, but the Alien Act, are you arguing that that is somehow illegitimate, or are you just simply saying it was wrongly applied to Shylock?
The Alien Act is totally illegitimate. I mean, it's an act that has completely disparate treatment of a certain group of people. It protects Venetian citizens in a way that non-citizens would not be protected. If somebody were to have made an attempt to murder my client, Shylock, that wouldn't have been a violation, and nothing would have happened whatsoever. And just to give an example from our case, the Duke saying to Shylock, if you don't convert to Christianity, I'm going to execute you.
But
that seems very
didn't the Duke
similar.
consider that the only chance that Shylock had for salvation, so far from being a penalty, it was a tremendous advantage to Shylock to be converted to a Christian, so then his soul could be saved.
You're absolutely correct, Your Honor. I think that's what he believed.
But in other words, the Duke was acting mercifully, and Shylock, who Portia begged to act mercifully, never did. Shylock refused up until the last minute to renounce the pound of flesh.
We can't dispute, Your Honor, that Shylock didn't act with all of the mercy that he could have in this proceeding. But I believe that the factors that we've talked about, the treatment that he experienced, his view that if he doesn't have his rights under the contract, what rights does he have? He's already treated in this totally unfair and disparate way. And the audacity of Antonio to act as though this penalty provision that he'd agreed upon and they'd talked about in detail and they'd negotiated and they'd reduced to writing was somehow an outrage, and Shylock was beyond the pale in trying to enforce the terms that they had agreed on.
Do you say he did not violate the alien rule because he didn't actually perform anything? yeah, against Antonio, even though he may have wanted to. He never did, is that?
That's exactly right, Your Honor.
Okay, your time is almost up, so do you want to just quickly sum up and?
Yes, Your Honor. To reiterate, we ask the court to once and for all vacate the decision below without leave for retrial of my client, that the 3,000 ducats be returned in full, that he be awarded interest on that money after all this time, and that the court award such further relief as you think is appropriate, particularly in light of what he and other Jewish residents in Venice suffered.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
We will now hear for counsel for the Merchant of Venice, Antonio, and the Republic of Venice.
Thank you, Your Honor, and may it please the court. I want to begin by rejecting the transparently false narrative that we've been presented with here. The notion that Shylock was engaged simply in a noble and honorable protest of what he thought to be the deficiencies and unfairness of Venetian law. That is simply not true. Never until this appeal have we heard that argument. And indeed, if we look at the record of the case again and again and again, it shows that Shylock entered into a premeditated and deceitful course of action in order to lure Antonio into sealing a bond that would be the means of his own destruction. And there are four critical elements in this scheme that are undisputed in the record of the case. First, throughout, Shylock admitted to his motives. Even before he negotiated the penalty bond, he was overheard to say, quote, speaking of Antonio, "I hate him, for he is a Christian. If I can catch him once on the hip, I will feed fat the ancient grudge I bear him." In fact, we heard Shylock himself a few minutes ago say that the pound of flesh would be used to bait fish withal, and that further, he would use that pound of flesh to feed his revenge. Other evidence of the motive of revenge and hatred abounds throughout the record of this case. But if there were any doubt, it would have been satisfied when at his trial, in response to questions by the Duke, he explained that his motive was a, quote, lodged hate and a certain loathing, end quote, for Antonio.
Counsel, before we get into your discussion of the merits of a criminal prosecution, I think you conceded at the outset that that turn of the proceedings from a civil suit to enforce a contract into a criminal case was highly inappropriate. Did you not make that concession in your brief?
Well, I think we have two responses to that, Your Honor. The first is that Antonio was permitted to use as a counterclaim and as a defense any law that would be available to him.
Can you bring in a civil case, a criminal prosecution, as a counterclaim?
Yeah, absolutely. Under the under the law of Venice at that time, this kind of pleading was recognized. But as we argued in our brief, Your Honor, we have an additional point, and that is we do agree on one point with Shylock, and that is that the procedures were flawed by reason of Portia's misrepresentations and masquerade. And for that reason, we've asked this court to consider the case de novo.
Well, Judge Reynolds reminded us that this is a court of review, not of first view. De novo, we would be looking at the case as a court of first instance, but we are an appellate forum. So we have no authority to hear witnesses. We judge the case according to the law. So I don't understand how you can ask this court to serve as a first instance de novo court.
Well, even if this court should decline to consider the case entirely anew, the opportunity through representation by very able counsel and the opportunity to make all of his arguments ensures that Shylock now has the right to argue against the application of the alien law to him.
And if the proceeding is improper, then I suppose an appellate court should just dismiss it. And if it dismisses the case, then where are we?
Well, if this court simply dismissed the case, then I think it would put Antonio and the Duke of Venice in the position that they would want to be in, because it would deny any and all relief to Shylock.
But you're not urging us to do that because you recognize that he did not get a fair trial, is that it?
We grant that the procedures were not fair procedures, yes.
Let me go to what seems to be your principal argument, that this was an act of vengeance on Shylock's part. But Shylock, when the transaction took place, called it a merry sport, a merry bond, and the really puzzling aspect of your position that it's all vengeance. At the time this bargain was made, Shylock had every reason to think that Antonio, rich merchant of Venice, would be able to repay him. He had no idea of the supposed tragedy at sea. He expected, as Antonio did, that Antonio would be, his wealth would be increased well within the time of the loan.
I think the record shows that from the very beginning, Shylock was scheming to trap Antonio. He deceived Antonio. He said to Antonio at the time that they were discussing the bond that he was offering the loan for reconciliation and friendship. He said, quote, "I would be friends with you and have your love," to Antonio. As you point out, he jovially referred to the penalty bond as a merry sport. And he quickly added that it was worthless. Nobody could expect him to ever claim the bond because a pound of a man's flesh taken from a man is not estimable, profitable neither, as flesh from muttons, beefs, and goats.
But what basis did Shylock have to even suspect that this question would arise, to suspect that Antonio would not be able to repay him? Antonio is a rich merchant. There was no premonition of storms at sea. Why would you attribute to Shylock such a motive of vengeance when Shylock had every reason in the world to expect that within the 3 months' time he would be repaid?
He was laying a trap. He understood that he would probably be repaid, but he also understood that if he were not, this would be his opportunity finally to have the revenge that he sought so dearly. And there's a little noticed fact that is very interesting in this case, and that is when he first heard about the opportunity to have a penalty bond from Antonio, he didn't have the money. Shylock didn't have the money. And so what did he do? He went to his moneylender friend, Tubal, and borrowed the money to lend in order to get the penalty bond. In other words, he was willing to pay interest to Tubal and make a loan free of charge. And that was to set up the trap. And it shows that throughout, from the very beginning to the very end, that even though he recognized that he would probably be repaid, the trap could be set, and he would have his revenge if he was not repaid.
One thing that Shylock was very clear about, he said it a few times, he said, I crave the law. But no one told him what the law was. Nobody told him about the Alien Act. So it's a obvious case of no notice or opportunity to rethink the case in light of the law. But Shylock craved the law. Once he's told what the law is, then the pound of flesh is off the table.
The pound of flesh is not a valid penalty bond under Venetian law. Venetian law, it's true, enforced commercial terms. The penalty bond here is not a commercial term. In fact, Shylock himself admitted many times that it was not a commercial term when he said that he would gladly give up repayment of 20 times the loan in order to enforce the penalty bond.
But what about the state of mind of your client, Antonio? Why did he agree to this so swiftly?
And just to follow up on that, I have a problem with that as well. I mean, it's not hard for me to understand why Shylock would want this bond, whether we think it was revenge or whether we think it was, political expression of some sort. But why would Antonio agree to be bound by this bond? Why would he agree to give up a pound of his own flesh just to get money for Bassanio? And what I'm thinking here is, really, is it possible that Antonio was the one laying the trap for Shylock? Because Antonio knew that Shylock would be hit with the Alien Act.
Well, there's no evidence in the record to suggest that
Well,
that
there
was
may
the
not. There may not be reference in the record to that, but I'm just speculating.
Well, may I interject that there are multiple clues in the record. When we first meet Antonio, he said, in sooth, I know not why I am so sad. He later says, I am tainted whether of the flock, meetest for death, meetest for death. So this is a very sad man who is longing for death.
I think he snapped out of that depression. But to answer the question, Antonio was fooled. He was taken in by the reconciliation and friendship that he thought were being offered by Shylock. And in fact, Antonio, just as he was going and sealing the bond, said, quote, there is much kindness in the Jew, end quote. And I have to say, although he's my client, that Antonio was easy prey in another sense. He was a profoundly, extravagantly proud man with an extravagant and exaggerated sense of honor. And Shylock, cunning as he was, preyed on this character defect of Antonio. And he did so in the following way. He recognized that if it ever came time to enforce the penalty bond, that Antonio would be too proud to dishonor it. That, in other words, he would admit it. And that's exactly what happened. Antonio didn't hire a lawyer. Antonio offered no defense. Antonio confessed the bond and offered himself up to be killed. And that's exactly what Shylock's scheme was. He knew that Antonio would not resist and that there would be no genuine court proceeding standing between himself and his opportunity to kill Antonio. And that's why the argument that there was an intercession of a court proceeding is a defense doesn't work, because Shylock, taking advantage of this character flaw, knew that there would be no meaningful judicial protection of Antonio.
Speaking of being taken advantage of, don't you think Shylock was, in a way, in that he never got due process? And he never had anybody to advise him of what the consequences would be or what the journey through the law would mean for him. Is it not amazing to you that you take a civil case and it ends up being a criminal case? And so should he not have been given due process along the way?
Well, let's take it in steps. In the negotiation of the penalty bond, I think that Shylock, as a very experienced moneylender, was very knowledgeable about the applicable law. And it shows that regardless of the criticisms we have of Venetian law, court proceedings were open to Jews in Venice, and the protection of the laws were applicable to them. You are right that when his case got to court, the charade, Portia's masquerade, did deny him due process, and we entirely agree with that. We think, however, that on the basis of the record and the devastating admissions repeatedly made by Shylock, that he properly stands convicted of the offense of which he was found guilty.
But how does the Alien Act come into the picture? You just said that Antonio wasn't putting up any defense. He certainly didn't raise the Alien Act. It was this sham lawyer, Judge Portia, who brought that.
Well, our brief points out that the intervention of Portia indeed saved the life of Antonio. It also saved the life of Shylock. And it saved Shylock because Shylock was ready, willing, and able to kill Antonio. The notion that Antonio would have been spared by Shylock is absolutely crazy. The record shows Shylock was earnestly sharpening his knife in the court, that Shylock had a balance scale in order to measure the pound of flesh. He was ready to do it, and it was only Portia that saved Antonio and also saved Shylock from himself.
Counsel, I'd like to ask a question here. I think we'd all agree that the record is beautifully written, but that it's rather thin, at least of the court proceeding. And I believe that you are asking us to draw a lot of inferences from the record. What about this inference, that Shylock never believed that the court would allow him to exact his pound of flesh? He does seem surprised in the court proceeding when Portia says, "You're right, you may enforce the penalty bond," and he praises her and sounds very surprised. Why isn't it as reasonable inference as you would have us draw that he was willing to put the knife to Antonio's heart? Why isn't it equally a valid inference that he never thought that the court would allow him to exact this measure, enforce the penalty bond literally?
Well, with all respect, we don't think there's any question of inference because we have the man's words. Again and again and again, those words evince nothing other than an intent to execute Antonio, to have revenge, and to realize the long-standing object of his hatred, that is the killing of Antonio.
But that's another inference. I mean, as Justice Ginsburg pointed out, he did say, Shylock said on several occasions, this is a merry bond. This is nothing to be worried about. And he does appear surprised when Portia says, "You're right, you win." Why is it not a proper inference for us to draw that he might have, since you want us to draw some inferences from the record, why isn't it appropriate to draw that inference as well?
As I read the record, beautifully written as it is, I'd characterize Shylock's reaction not as surprise, but as exultant delight.
Counsel, your time is about to run out, so you would like to
Thank you.
conclude.
For the reasons argued in our brief and the arguments that I would have made if I'd not had so many good questions, we believe that the judgment below was correct and that this court should arrive at the same judgment on its own initiative. Thank you.
Including conversion.
Absolutely, including conversion. That's to save the eternal soul of Shylock.
We will now hear from Portia's counsel.
Justice Ginsburg, and may it please the court. I am Teresa Miguel Stearns, counsel for appellee Portia. Some 400 years ago, Portia provided legal advice to the Duke of Venice. In a commercial contract dispute between appellant Shylock and co-appellee Antonio. This commercial contract dispute almost turned deadly. Portia's skillful navigation of Venetian law saved both men's lives. As a direct result in her role in this Shylock-Antonio dispute, Portia has suffered unjustified, targeted attacks to her reputation over the course of the last 400 years. Today, Portia asks that she be discharged from this case and from any future related proceedings. Your Honor, we have 5 points to our brief. However, the heart of our argument is first and foremost that Portia is the wrong defendant appellee in this case, and secondarily, that Portia's alleged misrepresentations to the court and alleged interest in the outcome of this matter are without merit or at most harmless error. And I will turn to those matters now. First, Portia is the wrong defendant appellee in this case. Counsel for Shylock is well aware that the Duke of Venice ruled the city in the 16th century. Portia's role was merely to provide legal advice to the Duke of Venice, who was the ultimate arbiter in this case.
Well, Portia, although she was not a lawyer, we can recognize that she knew something about the law. And surely she would have known that for Portia to give counsel to the Duke and to Shylock to stand there unrepresented, which he was willing to do when he was a civil plaintiff, being prosecuted and no counsel, apart from your conflict of interest, being married to the principal debtor, isn't that just overwhelming?
Your Honor raises 3 points, and I would like to address them all. First, that Portia was not learned in the law. The record demonstrates that Portia was indeed learned in the law. And in 16th century Venice, one did not need a university diploma or any type...
I am conceding that she was learned in the law. Maybe I misspoke or you misunderstood. Portia is learned in the law. She had to be such a trickster. But she is displaying her learning for the benefit of the Republic of Venice and Antonio, and Shylock is standing there with no one to represent him. He is the target of a criminal prosecution. Doesn't he have a right to counsel?
Your Honor, on the issue of notice, it was Shylock who dragged everyone into court. Bassanio, the Duke of Venice, and others tried to convince Shylock to settle this case amicably and financially prior to coming to court. But Shylock craved his bond. Shylock wanted his pound of flesh, so he brought everyone into court on a civil proceeding. This case never turned into a prosecution. Portia was never a prosecutor, and the Alien Act remained a civil forfeiture case. As soon as Portia explained to the Duke of Venice what was involved in the alien statute, before Shylock had to utter a word, the Duke of Venice immediately said, no, we are not going to consider this capital punishment case. We will keep it as a civil forfeiture case, and Shylock's estate was the only thing in jeopardy. Shylock's life or freedom were never in jeopardy throughout the course of these proceedings.
But Shylock never knew that the law put him in that position. He said repeatedly, I crave the law. Had he been counseled, he would have known what the law was and escaped the forfeiture.
Respectfully, Your Honor, ignorance of the law is no defense. And in this matter—
But having no counsel to tell him what the law was.
Your Honor, respectfully, many people tried to convince Shylock to settle this case prior to it becoming the civil forfeiture case required by the Alien Act. In fact, when Portia first encountered Shylock, when she entered the courtroom, she said, who is the Jew and who is the merchant? She placed both people, both participants in this trial, at the same level in the eyes of the law. She
said, who is the Jew? Not who is the lender and who is the borrower.
Right, that's correct, Your Honor. This is what the transcript shows.
We have another clue to Portia's character. So she calls Shylock a Jew. Back in Belmont, when Morocco appears, she said, we don't need people of that dark complexion. So we know that this is a woman who entertains certain biases.
Your Honor, Portia had a very distinct idea in Belmont that she wanted to marry Bassanio. They had laid eyes on each other in the past, and she was hoping that Bassanio would be the suitor who would correctly guess the box, the casket that her father laid out.
Was Portia free to marry anybody she wanted to?
No, she was not, Your Honor. Portia was a wealthy orphan whose life was dictated by her late father. Her late father had provided for her education, but had also provided the method for dictating who her husband would be.
And that may have been very patriarchal, but she spoke about Morocco's burnished skin. There was her love for Bassanio surely did not require her to so disparage people from Morocco.
That's correct, Your Honor.
So we recognize that she has certain biases based on race against Morocco, against Shylock.
I would pick up on that. I see that clearly as a conflict of interest. As a conflict of interest, the unclean hands, because of Bassano, and she was to gain from this situation.
Yes, regarding the conflict of interest, Portia is alleged to have had both a financial and a personal conflict of interest in this case. I will address both. First, the financial conflict of interest. From the very beginning, Portia offered her own ducats to settle this case with Shylock. Even before she and Bassanio were married, she offered her ducats to Bassanio to help settle this case amicably. When Portia first walked into court, She pleaded with Shylock to settle the case. Financially, 2 times the amount, 3 times the amount, 10 times the amount of ducats, of her ducats, were offered to Shylock to settle this case. He refused. She brought in the quality of mercy speech, where she says, the quality of mercy, the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath.
And where was her mercy?
Your Honor.
Just a little bit later, she is urging Shylock, be merciful. And then she turns on him and said, I have no mercy for you.
I believe Your Honor is referring to the Alien Act, and it is actually Portia's mercy which saves both of their lives. When Portia is merely providing legal advice to the Duke of Venice. When Portia realizes that she is not able to convince Shylock to amicably and financially settle this case, she grants him specific performance on the contract, and that is to take the pound of flesh. But at the moment that Shylock is ready to carve out a pound of flesh from Antonio's chest, Portia stops the proceeding, strictly interprets the contract with the reference that was made earlier, in that a strict interpretation of the contract would require no more, no less than a pound of flesh, and not any other matter, no blood, no other matter, no bone, no organ. At that point, she also advises the Duke that Shylock's actions, Shylock's attempt to murder Antonio, which is not in doubt at this point, is punishable by the alien statute.
You're telling us then that the contract, it was impossible to enforce the contract. So the pound of flesh has to go by impossibility. Everyone knows you can't take flesh without blood as well. So then what would happen if he can't get the remedy he's demanding? He would get a substitutional remedy. He would get the ordinary remedy for breach of contract, that is, in this case, his money back.
Your Honor, respectfully, this contract was enforceable under the laws of Venice. This is a commercial contract, and Venice, as the international commercial hegemony that it was, required strict enforcement of all commercial contracts. The Duke knew this. Antonio knew this. Antonio even said this to his friends as he was going into court.
But if Portia is correct, the contract is impossible to enforce because you can't take flesh without taking blood. That is an impossibility.
Your Honor, it is my understanding that with a very hot knife, one can take flesh without blood. Your Honor, Portia's interest in this case was to make sure that both men walked out of the courtroom alive, not one on a stretcher having his chest carved out and bled to death, and not the other being dragged off to the hangman's gallows to meet his own demise. This is the sign of a merciful judge, not a conflicted one.
Ms. Miguel Stearns, I believe it's your position that Portia did not engage in any misrepresentation. Is that right? You've certainly pointed to facts in the record that do support the conclusion that she was very learned in the law. But didn't she engage in misrepresentation? And if so, doesn't that taint the proceeding so that the judgment should be set aside and there should be a retrial?
Your Honor, the only misrepresentation that Portia made was disguising herself as a man. That she was a woman had absolutely no bearing on the outcome of the case. She was legitimately in the court, having been sent there by Dr. Bellario to provide legal advice to the Duke of Venice. The Duke of Venice did not want to enforce the contract, even though he felt he needed to, because the laws of Venice need to be strictly enforced in order to retain its, as I mentioned,
Did Bellario know that Portia was married to the principal debtor in this case?
Your Honor, the record is not clear on that point. However, Dr. Bellario did know that Portia was learned in the law and very capable of providing appropriate legal advice to the Duke. Dr. Bellario wrote a letter personally to the Duke and attested to the Duke that he and Portia had reviewed the facts of the case, had turned over many books together, they had reviewed the appropriate law in this matter, and that Dr. Bellario furnished Portia with his opinion, which, on top of Portia's own legal acumen, would provide superb advice to the Duke of Venice. Dr. Bellario knew that she was going to disguise herself as a man and actually gave her the robes to do so. Dr. Bellario was a trusted legal advisor of the Duke of Venice, and he was ill that day, so he sent Portia in his stead. Portia had no conflict of interest in this matter other than to see the dispute resolved amicably and see both men alive.
Did she not at some point at the end reject Shylock's request for repayment?
Yes, Your Honor, she did. And that is because multiple times throughout the course of the proceedings, Shylock had been offered to settle the case financially. At some point, when he finally said, "No, I demand my bond," and Portia advised that specific performance would be the only remedy, at that point, any negotiations are off the table. Venice is a place of no takebacks. You don't get two chances in Venice. Once they passed the point of settling the case amicably and financially, that door was closed. There's no right to say, oh, well, I guess I can't take my pound of flesh, so okay, let's go back in time, I'll take the money and leave. That is just not the law in Venice.
Portia's motivation to get involved in this, I don't quite understand the way you're characterizing it. She decides to get involved after she's heard that Antonio has lost his ships. She says that she decides that she must help Antonio because Antonio must be a wonderful person since he's the best friend of her husband. And at that point, she decides that she's going to play this trick. Doesn't that motivation in and of itself show that she is deeply conflicted here in terms of her interests in the matter?
Your Honor, as I've mentioned, Portia is not conflicted in this case. It's true that Bassanio and Antonio were friends, but Portia had never met Antonio. Portia had never met Shylock. Portia was only concerned about providing proper legal advice and ensuring that both men walk out of this case alive.
How can you say that when the only reason she went to Bellario and the only reason she then went to Venice was in the interest of her husband?
Your Honor, Portia, as a woman in 16th century Venice, had very limited opportunities to pursue a career. This was an opportunity not only to save the life of a friend of her husband's, but also to put her legal education to use. She knew that Dr. Bellario, her cousin, would properly recommend her, and Dr. Bellario would not have recommended a cousin, someone who wouldn't be able to provide legal advice, much less a female cousin, to send into court, putting his own reputation on the line, providing advice to the Duke of Venice. Dr. Bellario was a trusted advisor of the Duke of Venice. He was a career member of the legal community, and he would not have put his entire career on the line for Portia. Your Honor, I see my time is up. If I may just close by saying that Portia requests, once again, that she be discharged from this case and relieved of any liability in this matter. Portia did not have a conflict of interest. Her appearance as a man did not affect the outcome of this case. She was qualified to provide legal advice, and but for Portia's legal acumen, Shylock would have murdered Antonio, and Shylock himself would have been executed. Rather, Portia, despite attempts over and over again to convince Shylock to show mercy, she saved both Shylock's and Antonio's lives with her skillful navigation of Venetian law. But even if this court does not agree that Portia acted sincerely, Portia is the wrong defendant appellee in this case. The appellee should be the city-state of Venice alone. Portia was merciful, and in that spirit would be wholly in favor of this course reversing the Duke of Venice's order that Shylock convert to Judaism, just as Portia would have liked to have freely and openly practiced law in 16th century Venice, and so she persisted. Thank you for your generous time and your merciful attention.
Each counsel will now have 2 minutes of rebuttal.
Your Honor, I'm going to be very brief, but I'd like to address a factual point that I think is very important that's come up. Counsel for Antonio and for the Republic of Venice has tried to totally turn the facts on their head, and somehow Antonio, even though he's had this financial windfall and has forced Shylock to convert to Christianity, somehow he's the victim. And there really isn't any evidence in the record to support that, and I'd like to just point out 2 things that Chief Justice Ginsburg pointed us to. The first is that obviously when Antonio entered into this bond, it was a merry sport for him because he thought there was no way in the world it was ever going to come due. He had multiple ships at sea, and it was only through his bad fortune that the bond itself came due. And the second point is, Chief Justice Ginsburg pointed out that very early in the record, we learned that Antonio is a melancholy man, and it really doesn't make a lot of sense that he's been victimized here. And a strange aspect of all the facts are, after this proceeding where Antonio has had this incredible victory that's totally has no basis in law, we don't see him celebrating. We don't see him exclaiming. We really never see that. And so I would just submit to the court, does that fit with the view that he's been somehow victimized by my client? Thank you.
I have 2 clients, Antonio and the Duke of Venice, and the Duke is primarily concerned that justice be done and that his court be fair. He had no knowledge of the masquerade of Portia. And he's asked me to make the point that there were misrepresentations. The so-called letter of Dr. Bellaria, which was read in court, recites that Balthasar visited him and that Balthasar and he went over the court cases and the law. Not that Portia had any participation in that. And then Portia, speaking to Nerissa, says about the upcoming masquerade, "Our husbands shall see us in such habit that they will think we are accomplished with what we lack In other words, she was admitting that she was not accomplished in law, and that she would dress as a lawyer and seem to be accomplished with what she lacked. But the big picture is this. Shylock had a scheme to murder Antonio, a leading citizen of Venice. He could have been convicted and executed. The Duke spared his life. Antonio...
We were told by Portia's counsel that the Alien Act was a civil forfeiture measure, nothing about hanging.
The law, as it is stated in the record, gives the Duke absolute discretion as to whether or not to have executed any persons who violate the Alien Act. It's not simply civil forfeiture. The Duke here was merciful. Antonio himself gave up the half share of Shylock's fortune that he could have claimed on the mild condition that Shylock give it to his daughter and son-in-law upon his death. Justice was done here, and we ask this court to recognize that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
Perhaps you can clarify your point about the Alien Act being only a civil forfeiture measure.
Your Honor, the point there was that, so the Alien Act does say that any non-citizen of Venice who attempts murder or commits murder, either directly or indirectly, could be punishable by death and forfeiture of the state. That was the law that Portia advised to the Duke of Venice, but it never went to a criminal matter. There are very discrete steps in Venice, starting well before the 16th century, in how criminal cases are handled. And they are not converted from a civil case to a criminal case on the fly in a courtroom. There are trained prosecutors that bring charges, and there are separate trials in criminal matters in Venice in the 16th century. What happened here was that the law was interpreted as a civil forfeiture case. Shylock was never in jeopardy of losing his life or losing his liberty, simply of civil forfeiture of his estate. I would like to address now the 2 points that co-appellee for Antonio raised. First, that the Duke believed that he was receiving legal advice from Balthazar. Again, co-appellee is bringing gender into this case. Yes, it's true that that's who the Duke thought he was receiving legal advice from, a man named Balthazar, someone who was trained in the law named Balthazar. Dr. Bellario knew full well that Portia was disguising herself as Balthazar and providing legal advice to the Duke of Venice. That she was a woman, again, had absolutely no bearing on this case, regardless of what her name was. Second, counsel for Antonio just referred to Act 4, Scene 3, line 59. Where Nerissa and Portia are preparing to go to the trial, where Portia is preparing to disguise herself as a man, to put on judicial robes as we have on today, which can hide anyone's gender. Nerissa asks Portia, "Shall they see us?" referring to their husbands. And Portia responds in full, "They shall, Nerissa, but in such a habit that they shall think we are accomplished with what we lack. I'll hold thee any wager when we are both accoutred like young men, I'll prove the prettier fellow of the two." Portia was not referring to their legal education. Portia was referring to what would be hidden underneath the robes. Unless this court has any additional questions, we will rest on the previous statements made in terms of what Portia desires from this court.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
The court will take a recess to confer on this case.
Okay. Hi. This is a little different than an ordinary court proceeding in which now would be the time to get a cup of coffee, check your smartphones, and try to guess how long it will be before the justices return. I've been tasked with two things. One, to keep you entertained until they do in fact return. And the other is to provide a little insight and background as a literary and cultural historian into the play and into the way it mattered both in Shakespeare's day and in our own. It's tricky, though, to guess just how long they're going to deliberate. And I was in Venice when Justice Ginsburg took on this role last year. But I'm just guesstimating, so I've been instructed if my 14 to 15 minutes of speaking does not cover, I'm going to take questions from the audience until they do return. But I'm hoping to time it just right. About 20 years ago, I wrote a book called Shakespeare and the Jews. And one of the things that I learned in writing that book was the persistence of various myths that have attached themselves to the connection between Shakespeare and Jews. Two of those myths concern the expulsion of the Jews in 1290 and their readmission in 1656. And no matter how many times scholars point this out, there was no readmission order in 1656. There, in fact, is no expulsion order in 1290. The complex story of the persecution of the Jews in late medieval and early modern England is poorly understood and often misrepresented. Yet another myth is that there were no Jews in England in Shakespeare's day. Historians have shown that there were about 150 to 200 Jews living in London and Bristol in Elizabethan England, and had Shakespeare actually wanted to speak with one, he could have gone to a convert's house, the Domus Conversorum on Holborn Street, and spoken to a man named Nathaniel Menda, who had been born Yehuda Menda, and was publicly converted in London by John Fox, more famous as a martyrologist and for his acts and monuments, but also a man who took pleasure in converting a North African Jew and celebrating that before his Christian community. But I'd much rather talk today less about the history of the Jews in England than about the ways in which someone like me, who's been teaching this play for 30 years and working on productions of it on both sides of the Atlantic, sees it in ways that are quite different than even the most brilliant legal minds see it. So I'll try to share that with you. The discussion we've heard quite brilliantly for the last hour or so concerns the famous courtroom scene in Act 4 of Shakespeare's play. I see it in a radically different way. Consider Portia's situation. She's been married for a very brief time to a very handsome man that she has long wanted to marry. And in the time between the moment where he successfully chose the right casket and the moment that she speaks her famous lines about the quality of mercy, she's discovered that the man she's hoping and planning to spend the rest of her life with is deeply and emotionally connected to someone else. And if she has any doubts about that, she learns it at this trial. Here's what Antonio says to her husband moments before she delivers that famous speech. This is Antonio to Bassanio. Commend me to your honorable wife. Tell her the process of Antonio's end. Say how I loved you. Speak me fair in death, and when the tale is told, bid her be judge, whether Bassanio hath not once a love. Repent but you that you shall lose your friend, and he repents not that he pays your debt. For if the Jew cut but deep enough, I'll pay it presently with all my heart. And if she has any doubts at this point about Antonio's intentions for her husband, this is Bassanio's response delivered before her, although he doesn't know that Portia is disguised and in court. Antonio, I am married to a wife which is as dear to me as life itself, but life itself, my wife, and all the world are not with me esteemed above thy life. I would lose all, I sacrifice them all here to this devil to deliver you. What's Portia to do? I mean, if she kills Antonio, just imagine what she'll be hearing for the rest of her life from Bassanio. He loved me so much more than you did. I don't know why I ended up with you and not him. She can't let Antonio die. But if she lets Antonio live, she's stuck in a love triangle that she can never get out of. The brilliance of Portia in this scene is that she resorts to a legal fiction to save her marriage. In suggesting this, I'm really saying that in the moment that it was first staged, and for the 4 centuries after it was first written, The Merchant of Venice remains a really complex and deeply enigmatic work of art that raises many more questions than we can answer even in this moot court. Is the disguise Portia's question upon entering the court? Which is the merchant here and which the Jew? To be taken seriously? Or, as in so many productions, is it a laugh line? As Justice Ginsburg indicated earlier, is Portia a racist for her dismissal of a dark-skinned Muslim Moroccan prince when she says, "Let all of his complexion choose me so"? Is Antonio so sad because of his financial worries or because of his unsanctioned love for Bassanio, which remains unrequited? Is the play so troubling because, as many have felt, its portrayal of Shylock is nakedly anti-Semitic? Or alternatively, is it so disturbing because it exposes what ugly myths lead those with insecure identities, be they Christian or Jew, to think and do when threatened, or for intimating that hostility to difference of all kinds, whether that difference is racial or national, sexual or religious, deforms those who are intolerant and coarsens any society that condones it? These are the questions that don't go away. And for me, as a cultural historian and theater historian, what's fascinating is how they manifest themselves in different times and in different places. In Nazi Germany, this was a favorite play, staged 50 different times in different productions, although those productions did not allow for the intermarriage of Jessica and Lorenzo. Some of you may be familiar in the last week or so with a protest and controversy at the Delacorte Theater in Central Park, where a Shakespeare play has been performed and where there were very aggressive protests that tried to stop that production. That was a production of Julius Caesar. Some of you may be less aware that in 1962 at the Delacorte Theater, the very first year in which that theater in Central Park staged plays, there was a different protest, a protest about The Merchant of Venice and an attempt to stop the wide circulation and demonstration of that play. Joe Papp, in that year, had cast the really extraordinary actor George C. Scott as Shylock. And Scott's portrayal of Shylock was a really sympathetic one. He later said, and I quote, "I played Shylock as though he were dead right, and that he was screwed." But there were objections nonetheless to performing this play in 1962, 17 years after the end of the Second World War and the exposure of the Holocaust. Members of the Jewish war veterans picketed it, and the New York Board of Rabbis wrote to the New York Times trying to stop a telecast of that production, which would have gone out to 2 million television viewers. The rabbis wrote, and I quote, "To put it bluntly, the play which Shylock presented as the typical Jew amounts to a distortion and defamation of our people and our faith." Now, while I respect their concerns, I believe that their position is wrong, and I'll suggest through a final example why it is so dangerously so, and why we need to keep staging and not censoring Shakespeare. When I finished writing my book, Shakespeare and the Jew, I took a trip to Israel, and this was back in 1994. And I went to see a production of The Merchant of Venice at the Camry Theater in Tel Aviv. And it was a little weird at first. My Hebrew's pretty good, but I'm not used to seeing an all-Jewish cast of The Merchant of Venice. It took a while, and the actor playing Shylock began in the early scenes of the play as a secular Jew, his head uncovered, wearing a nice suit. But when his daughter Jessica was stolen away from him, he became radicalized, and he started wearing the kippah, or head cover, of a settler Jew, and he became aggressively furious at everybody, spraying an imaginary Uzi at everybody involved. And it became a very disturbing production. And it was a disturbing production in part because the director had done this intentionally, to draw attention to what had happened while this play was being rehearsed. And that was an attack by someone like me who had been born in Brooklyn and actually gone to my elementary school, Baruch Goldstein, who had entered the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron and killed over a score of Palestinians and wounded 100 others. And this production was trying to engage with that in a very direct way. One of the things that I love about theater, and about Shakespeare in particular, is the way in which his works somehow are able to get at things that newspapers, radio, media today don't get at. They have, if you will, a predictive quality. And one of the things that I enjoyed so much about the moot court we've all experienced today is that it touched upon many central issues that we are still wrestling with today. Access to education, the status of aliens, the rights of women to equal education, and the like. This production at the Camry Theater in 1994 also strangely had a predictive quality. About 6 or 8 months after I saw that production, a man named Yigal Amir, cut from the very same cloth as the man Shylock morphed into, shot Yitzhak Rabin shortly after the Oslo Accords had been signed and put an end to that possibility of peace in the Middle East. And it's extraordinary to me, as I still reflect on it 20 some odd years later, the ways in which a performance of Shakespeare's play can tell us something about what's bubbling up within the culture. I'll stop at this point, and I will take questions from the audience. There's one in the front row. What I'm going to do, since this is being taped, is I'll repeat the question, and if I don't know the answer to it, I'll turn it into a question that I can answer.
What about the fact that Shakespeare wrote this play in rebuttal to Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Love?
That's a really good question. Sure. The question is, what about the fact that Shakespeare wrote this play in response to or rebuttal to Christopher Marlowe's play, The Jew of Malta? These are really very, very different plays. And you can say that he wrote the play in rebuttal to. Some might believe that he wrote the play, in a sense, to capitalize on the interest in Jewish questions. I'm a Jewish guy from Brooklyn, but I'll be the first to admit that Shakespeare and Marlowe were not really interested in living Jews, even though there were 100 or so living amongst them. They were interested in Jews because Jews enabled them to understand their own culture at a moment of great, how should I put it, great change. In Shakespeare's day, everybody's grandparents had been Catholic. A Protestant Reformation had led to the establishment where everybody was now officially, or mostly, Protestant. And then with Mary, that changed back to Catholicism, and under Elizabeth, back to the Protestant faith. Religion, which had once been so stable, was now unstable. International relations between Christians, Jews, and Muslims were far more complicated in an age of empire. And notions of what constituted a nation, or a race, or a people, all of which bubble up in this play, and all of which we're still wrestling with 400 years later, come into play both in Marlowe's work and Shakespeare. So I'm loath to say that it's a rebuttal of. I would just say both of these plays are written at a moment of uncertainty, and two of the greatest dramatists who wrote in England turned to explore questions of Jewishness as a way to try to help English playgoers at the time wrestle with their own conflicted identities. Let me take another couple of questions, and hopefully Justice Ginsburg will return with a verdict. Another question. I'll come forward.
To what do you attribute the intense knowledge that Shakespeare had of the law?
To what do I attribute the intense knowledge that Shakespeare had of the law? Shakespeare cared about the law, and like many in his litigious day, had a lot of legal interests and a lot of legal controversies. This was a man who wrote 36 of the greatest plays in English and also pursued a debt for £7. So he actually cared. And because he was involved in so many real estate cases, he had a vested interest in that. He had a vested interest in securing for his father and his heirs a coat of arms. So almost everywhere Shakespeare turned in the period in which he was a playwright and a shareholder in a theater and a member of a joint stock company, he had very particular legal interests to protect. And I think Shakespeare was a pretty fast study, and I think he was a pretty fast study when it came to the law, and I think he was the best listener. We don't attribute Shakespeare's listening abilities as high as we attribute his writing abilities, I suppose. But I am sure he sat down with more than one or two lawyers and bought them drinks and pumped them for all the information he could get. None quite as brilliant as Justice Ginsburg, but enough to write plays like this. Next question, please. Yes.
I have two questions. One, do you think there's any connection to the theory that Shakespeare's family were secret Catholics? And two, how would you summarize the majority of literary critics' view of Shylock? Is it, given that speech hath not a Jew eyes, etc., is it by and large through the ages, and especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, been positive or critical and negative?
I'll answer the first question first. Was Shakespeare a secret Catholic? We have no idea what Shakespeare's religious beliefs were. We have no idea what his political beliefs were. We don't know whether he liked dogs or not. All we have are 36 plays and very little biographical evidence. And one of the dangers is reading the life out of the works. What's so dangerous is Shakespeare doesn't speak what his views are in the plays. He creates characters who express views which tend to collide with other views. And that's something that's lost. When I'm sitting in the house at the Delacorte, listening to people confused about identifying Shakespeare's views on tyranny vis-a-vis Caesar, those are Brutus's views, those are Cassius's views, those are the crowd's views. Shakespeare hides, in a sense, his own views, and had he wanted to express them, he could have been the greatest preacher of his day. But that's not what he decided to do for a living, thank God. The second question is, what do Shakespeareans think of Shylock, and are they pro or con? I have to tell you, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I'm sympathetic to him. Tuesday, Thursdays, and Sundays, I'm less so. I think for me, the honest answer to that question is, what's more important is to see what the play means in history, how it spools out in different times and different places. There's a wonderful film, little known, in part because it's in Hebrew, that came out shortly after the Six-Day War, and it's called Avanti Populo. And it's one of the greatest adaptations or moments that touch on this play. And in that play, an Israeli platoon has defeated in the Sinai Desert an Egyptian one. And the Egyptians include an Egyptian actor who was conscripted in the 67 war. And the Egyptian soldiers are dying of thirst. And the Egyptian soldier, who is an actor in real life, goes up and tries to grab a canteen of one of the Israeli soldiers, and he's brusquely thrown down. And he picks himself up and he does it again, and he's thrown down yet again. And he brushes himself off. He speaks Arabic, they speak Hebrew. English is the only thing they share. And he says in English, the first English spoken in this film, "I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes, senses?" And you've heard that speech brilliantly delivered earlier. And it's a breathtaking moment that dissolves the difference between these two opposing forces. And they actually, for a brief while, before a tragic ending, join forces. So I guess my answer is, I'm less interested in what Stephen Greenblatt of Harvard or David Kasten of Yale think about Shylock. I'm interested in what the play tells us about ourselves and our cultural moments over time. Yes.
Unless I'm interpreting this wrong, it seems that Shakespeare was incredibly progressive with his views, whether it was about women, whether it was about a man loving another man, etc. You know, how do we account for that?
I think Shakespeare had his finger on the pulse of his age, and I'm getting off this stage very quickly because our jurists have returned. Thank you.
The court has reached a unanimous judgment, but before I announce it, we all agree that Shylock, Antonio, and Portia were represented by most excellent counsel. So to start with our judgment, Shylock's advocate conceded that the pound of flesh is out of the case, so that is off the table. We are also going to hold Shylock to his statement that he wanted not a jot of interest. So he gets no interest. But he does get back his principal as a substitutional remedy because he didn't get the pound of flesh. The conversion was only one party who was still insisting on the conversion, but we are going to take Counsel for Portia's good advice that the conversion should be vacated. So Shylock gets his money back because otherwise Antonio would be unjustly enriched. And the forfeiture, that is out because the Duke explains that this alien statute leaves it in his judgment whether to take Shylock's life. So that is a criminal sanction. Therefore, the alien statute is out of the case. And we also grant Portia's motion to be dismissed from these proceedings. And that's the sum of it. And now I think each of my colleagues will comment briefly.
I'll start us off. What a pleasure it has been to serve with my 3 sisters and 1 brother on the bench. What a pleasure to hear from the able counsel and to be a part of this. Teresa Miguel Stearns, you were such a wonderful advocate for your client. I hope you will tell her that I think she would be a really wonderful candidate for admission to Wake Forest Law School.
I wanted to thank the Law Library here at the Library of Congress for what they have done and the commemoration of the Ghetto in Venice and bringing up Shakespeare, whose birthday was April 23rd. I'm reminded of what Fielding once said when he said, "Damn those ancients. They've stolen my thoughts." And when I think of Shakespeare, when I think of The Merchant of Venice and all of those lines that we've heard and what they signify, you know, there's so much in that. There's so much perception, provocation, sentimentality, and humor in the play and as it has been depicted. And I want to say also, I do think the counselors were fantastic. I enjoyed being with the judges, and to me, Justice Ginsburg is a role model and an idol, and I very much appreciated being here with her. And thank you, Dick, for setting it up too. So, and thank you. You've been a great audience. The enthusiasm has been there, and the humor and understanding. Thank you.
Thanks. I add my thanks as expressed by the Honorable Reynolds and Morella, and my appreciation to everyone for putting this on and such wonderful performances by everybody. It was great. In the 18th century, people could not accept, when I say people, the English I'm thinking of mostly, couldn't accept bad endings, tragic endings, and so they changed the endings of several of the plays. They changed the ending of King Lear, for example, to make sure that Cordelia lives and Lear lives, and they go happily off, father and daughter. They changed the ending of Hamlet so that Hamlet and Ophelia get married. I feel like, to a certain extent, this is exactly what we're doing when we have this periodically repeated appeal of Shylock. I feel like we're somehow adding our own ending to a very sad story that Shakespeare told about excluding people and excluding groups of people, women and Jews and Moroccans, as was brought up here, and that we continue to struggle with this as a society, and so that our doing this really is, in that sense, kind of re-adding another ending, getting another chance at finding some justice here. So it's been great to be part of that process. And I have to say as well, from the heart, that I so appreciate Justice Ginsburg again for agreeing to do this. She did it in Venice with me last summer, and to do it now again was really very generous. And she also, for me, is an incredible idol and role model. And I just thank her for agreeing to do this.
I should also say thank you to the Law Library for inviting me. It has been a very great experience, especially with such a distinguished panel. I'm also glad that Shylock dignity has been restored, even though with a little bit of delay, but as Italian, I know that justice might be slow, so I'm happy that you finally got it.
Okay, the cast has agreed to take a few questions, and so we have some microphones out in the audience. So please raise your hand, and they'll hand you a microphone. You can ask any of the cast members, except me, questions, and direct them, or you can just ask general questions. So I can't. Okay, I don't think we have any questions. Maybe we had questions before. But I do want to, on behalf of the Law Library of Congress, I would like to thank all of the cast members and speakers tonight. And let me also thank Shylock for a terrific performance. And also, I'll add my thanks to Justice Ginsburg, because this is a very busy time, as you know, for the Supreme Court. So we really appreciate her being here. So please join us upstairs in the Great Hall for a reception. Our volunteers will show you the way. And again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.